Hello and welcome to Women of the Middle East podcast. This podcast relates the realities of Arab women and their rich and diverse experiences. It aims to present the multiplicity of their voices and wishes to break overdue cultural stereotypes about women of the Middle East. Season 5 is a collaboration between Musawah and Women of the Middle East podcast. As we will be discussing Musawah's latest book, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage Towards Egalitarian Ethics and Laws, published by One World Academic in December of 2022. My name is Emmanuel. I'm a feminist, scholar, and an educator.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.
Hello and welcome to Women of the Middle East podcast, Season 5, in which we go through the chapters of the recently published book, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. In the previous episodes, we talked to authors who contributed to the first two sections of the book, reconstructing marriage as a constitution based on justice and beauty, compassion, equity, through ethically based and holistic interpretations of the Quran and Hadith. Today, we focus on Section 3, Islamic Legal Theory and Ethics, which consists of 3 chapters. These chapters focus on ethics and Islamic legal tradition in theory and practice, proposing new approaches to interpretation that preserve principles and standards within tradition while addressing today's needs, contexts, and standards. I'm happy to have Dr. Nevin Reda joining us to speak about her chapter in Section 3 titled Reform of Usul al-Fiqh and Marriage, a spiritually integrative approach. Dr. Nevin, lovely to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be with you on this podcast.
Thank you. Dr. Nevin, what attracted you to this project, and what do you want to achieve from this project as both a scholar, a researcher, and a woman?
That's a big question. So there's a lot of things that attracted me to this project. But as I'm sure you're aware, there's a great need for justice within Muslim societies. We've seen it in the Arab Spring. You know, people are really crying out and calling for justice. And without justice in the institution of marriage, there really can't be any justice in society, because that's the building block of any society. It's the first and most important of all human relationships. So if you don't develop that value of justice within that really foremost human relationship, you're not going to see it in the rest of society. So this is really one of the important things that attracted me to this project, the importance of reintroducing justice within the Muslim marriage. As you may be aware, as I imagine some of the other contributors have spoken to the topic, justice, that marriage is conceptualized on the model of slavery within classical fiqh, where you have men providing money in return for women's sexual availability, which really isn't a just construction of marriage. And so what I'm trying to do here is reconceptualize marriage in the form of something similar to a school for spiritual advancement, where important values like fidelity and justice and compassion get instilled. So people grow spiritually on their path to closeness to God. These are incredibly important for spiritual advancement, but also more generally for people's well-being in society. So that's really one of the important things that attracted me to this project. Historically, much of our tradition has excluded the scholarly contributions and perspectives of women. My particular area of expertise is Quran, although I also work in ethical legal theory. But definitely when it comes to Quranic studies, tafsir, exegesis, I have not been able to find a single woman exegete, a single mufassira between the two Aishas, and that's Aisha, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, may God be pleased with her, and the 20th century exegete, Aisha Abdurrahman. So not a single woman. So that's a really strange lack. And it's one of the reasons why our tafsir, when it comes to women's issues, is so unbalanced. And so there's a huge gap between what the text is actually saying and between the interpretations that are attempted to be imposed upon them. upon the text. So one of the other things that really attracted me about this project is the opportunities that it provides for women's scholarly contributions and women's perspectives, which have historically been so marginalized and continue to be marginalized within the masculinist framework of Quran and fiqh and a whole bunch of other disciplines.
Absolutely. In your chapter, you critically engage with traditional Islamic legal theory through an Islamic feminist, spiritually integrative approach to usul al-fiqh that builds on an understanding of marriage as a site of spiritual growth that better fits the needs of our time and applies to our context now in terms of marriage or divorce. How can we develop a modern Islamic legal theory that is authentic to the Quran's central message, yet addresses the needs of today?
Well, obviously there's a need for spirituality and justice today and all these beautiful values. So what I do, if we want to go in depth into the methodology that I'm proposing, so I'm looking at the four main usul, the four main principles, and re-envisioning them and in ways that are more in keeping with the instructions and the directions and the teachings in the Quran. So the four principles that I'm suggesting are similar to the old ones, the classical ones. The first is Quran, obviously, although here too there's a major change, and it has to do with insisting on closeness to the literal meaning of the text, and instead of interpretations that don't quite fit, but fit masculinist privilege. But also what's really very different here is the insistence on the importance of organization of the text. So understanding the structure of each surah and understanding how each surah builds on the one before, and understanding the importance and the rationale for the organization of the Quran. That's really the main contribution here. And then when it comes to the Hadith, I also look at it as a historical source for the example of the Prophet, and as a secondary source that we can use with together with reason or with the Quran, but not as an independent source for ethical legal legislation. Certainly not in the sense of revelation equal or over above the Quran, as we see it sometimes used in ethical legal theory, classical ethical legal theory. And then the third is dalil al-aql, or reason. And here too, I think we have some really fabulous tools for doing ethical legal reasoning in the Islamic tradition. Like istishab, istihsan, istislah, so many really excellent tools. What I'm adding here is a new one, which also stems from the Quran, because all of these theories, they stem from contemplating the Quran and thinking about the Quran. So I'm also adding a new one, and I'm calling it isti'dal, which basically means seeking justice. And what I do here is I look at the different terms that we have for justice in the Quran, like qist and adl, equity, looking at the vulnerabilities in society, which is what qist does, and adl, and words like tatfif, and ensuring that we actually have a working principle that we can use to ensure that we have justice within fiqh. Which is, justice is really a value that's quite absent there, especially gender justice. And the fourth, which is really the biggest change in the theory that I'm proposing, and it has to do with the consensus or ijma', and as you may be aware, it's a very important principle in the classical tradition. Unfortunately, when you look at the Quran, the only occurrences of ijma' in the same form, in the same root, are all negative. I mean, you have Noah's people coming to a consensus against him. You have Joseph's brothers coming to a consensus to throw him into a well. You have Pharaoh's magicians coming to a consensus against Moses. So in every instance, consensus, that word doesn't occur positively. So I've retained the deliberative and consultative aspect of ijma, but re-envisioned it in the form of shura, which means consultation, and that is very well represented in the Quran and positively represented in the Quran. So that's the biggest change. And it's also a lot more practical, and there are certain steps in contemporary fiqh, the way fiqh is done today with the collective ijtihad, the collective deliberations that we see in the various different fiqh councils. So there are steps moving in that direction. So this is the basic framework that I'm using within my paper to re-envision and reconceptualize and formulate the principles of ethical legal theory in Islam.
And you formulate this framework, you construct this framework through what you call a spiritually integrative approach. Could you tell us more about this approach and how you named it such a thing? Yeah, please.
Sure. Yeah. So spiritually integrative, what it means is basically integrating the importance of spirituality again. It's connecting between fiqh and spiritual advancement. So within the Islamic experience of spirituality, you find several stages that a self, a person, or a soul goes through. Beginning with an-nafs al-ammara bis-su, which is the insightful self that incites to bad things, and moving on to the self-critical self, the self that takes responsibility for its own actions, the ethical self, that's an-nafs al-lawama. And so in any path to spiritual advancement, ethics is and good practices is incredibly important. So what I'm doing is I'm integrating fiqh back into that holistic view of human spirituality and human advancement. And it stems from also my work on structure of the Quran and style of the Quran and how I see its surahs organized, where you have each surah building on the other and contributing a very important spiritual growing edge. So it also stems from my research on the Quran's interpretation, where the Quran is really a spiritual pathway or a spiritual method that leads a self from an-nafs al-ammara bis-su, the insightful self, all the way to the higher levels of the self. Each surah is a stage within that particular framework. You see the Quran mixing between, practical instructions and stories and theological reflections and names of God. So it's a integrated approach that I'm seeing utilized there in the way in the style of the Quran, and I'm really getting inspired from how the Quran is structured, surah after surah, to try and connect between fiqh and the practical instructions and the higher spiritual aims of closeness to God and realizations of the latent divine qualities within a human being that can serve in their spiritual advancement. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here.
How do you view the relationship between the Quran and Hadith in deducing rulings, especially that we know that in the history of Islamic feminism, some Islamic feminists have avoided engaging with the Hadith in specific?
Oh, thank you. So for that question. So I totally have issues with the principle as-sunnah qadiya ala al-Qur'ani wa nasikhah lah, which basically means the sunnah is a judge over the Quran and abrogates it. So The meaning of this in practical terms is basically if you have a Quranic text and you have a hadith that are in conflict with each other, that contradict each other, that you basically take the hadith over and above the Quran and throw the Quran aside. So this is a principle that I have issues with, and we see it in action and fiqh. We see it, for example, in the inheritance laws. The foundation for inheritance in the Quran is in Surah Al-Baqarah, and it's testamentary inheritance. It explains to people that they need to give directions before they die so that people know what to do with their wealth or anything they leave behind. To instruct people as to where and it should go and who should get what. And that's in Surah Al-Baqarah. And there are very strong warnings against changing a person's will or, after they've passed away. And so that very important text has been, abrogated based on a hadith. And the hadith is very unclear. It's short. I mean, it's a great hadith. I definitely think very highly of it, but I think it's been misinterpreted because hadith tend to be short, cryptic statements and open to so many different interpretations. And we really do not have a methodology for properly interpreting the hadith. So that's one of the examples when it comes to my approach to hadith. I think we really need to focus on methodology of interpretation. Yes, there are so many hadith that are inauthentic and so many that are authentic, but we really need to focus more on interpretation at this point in time because of, there's absolutely, interpretation is a mess when it comes to hadith. So in my particular methodology that I'm using hadith as I value hadith, especially as historical texts that can tell us something about the Prophet's example. For example, when it comes to divorce, he totally accepted a woman's right to divorce an unwilling husband. We have that in the example of Barira, which is, I think, incredibly important to know that. So I think hadith are important. However, we do need to focus attention on interpretation. And I can give you other examples if you want, where we have hadith interpreted in ways that really don't fit the Quranic meaning of words. And all they do is assert male privilege.
How might this book, in your opinion, be relevant to activists and feminists on the ground, working to reform laws to help promote gender justice and gender equality in their communities?
Okay, so many of the injustices that women are facing when it comes to things like divorce, when it comes to things like inheritance, when it comes to things like, domestic violence, mistreatment, abuse, so many problems in our legal systems are justified on the basis that this is Sharia and this is God's will. And when women say, this is really not the case, these texts have been misinterpreted. So you have proponents of and supporters of these injustices will often play the methodology card. They'll tell you, well, you know what, they had really good methodologies and sound methodologies, and what methodology are you using? So that tends to be a common argument. So what I'm doing actually in this book is really demonstrating the problems with our methodologies, in the way we interpret the Quran, and in the relationship between the Quran and the Hadith, in the way we interpret Hadith, in the absolute lack of justice in any of our, we don't have an independent asl, an independent principle for justice. And also the problem with consensus, which really contributes rigidity to our laws. So I'm looking at the methodological problems in our legal systems, in our ethical legal thinking, but I'm also proposing solutions. So it's a constructive critique. So I'm not just saying, these don't work and let's just throw them out the window. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, these folks, they did good work. They have contributed valuable contributions. However, they're not enough for our day and age. There is room for improvement. And this is what I'm trying to do. I'm providing, and what all of our contributors are doing. They're providing solutions to some of the problems that we're facing. And so it will help, hopefully, activists and practitioners on the ground just by demonstrating the problems that we have, but also some of the solutions.
Absolutely. But what do you think we could do to help spread the word? Of course, we're doing that through this podcast. Definitely, the book is going to be on our leading list at the college. But what else as a feminist community could we do to distribute this knowledge among our communities?
Well, it's all about really getting the word out. Right now, women don't have access to a lot of the networks that are supported by, governments and big money to promote masculinist scholarship. We don't, and they really don't want room for women within their respective pulpits. I mean, how often have you seen women imams in a mosque, for example? So we really need to have access to getting our word out in the various different information networks, hopefully also among youth, because they're really motivated and hopeful of seeing change in their societies, of seeing justice in their societies, and these, beautiful values that we see in the Quran actually implemented and actually reflected in their lived experiences in their respective contexts. So it's getting the word out, which you're doing, and so thank you very much for that. And also challenging the domination of men when it comes to religion and the interpretation of the religion and religious leadership positions. We really need to see more women there. For example, in so many of these fiqh councils, most of them are constructed of only men. I mean, where there are no women there. If you look at, Al-Majlis Al-A'la Likibar Al-Ulama, for example, they're mostly men. I mean, what is the percentage of women there? It's certainly not 50% or even 30%. It's more like 0%. And you see that in so many of the fiqh councils. If you do have women, like the Fiqh Council of North America, they have, I think, 3 women out of 19 men and 19 people. But we really need to see more women in decision-making positions when it comes to fiqh in these various different councils. We need to see them in religious leadership positions, and we need to see their voice valued and respected.
Well, thank you for being on this episode of Women of the Middle East podcast. This season has been dedicated to covering this amazing, incredible book. We do hope that we would all work together in disseminating the knowledge that is, of course, a part of this book, but also in promoting the woman behind the book, whom I had, the pleasure of meeting. Thank you so much, Doctora.
Thank you so much, Amal, for providing me with this opportunity and for the great work that you're doing in promoting women's scholarship and justice and beauty in Muslim societies and Muslim marriage in particular. Thank you so much.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of Season 5. To stay up to date with Women of the Middle East podcast, you can subscribe and don't forget to rate us. If you would like to contact me directly, you can do so on Instagram or Twitter or via email.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.